Welcome back to Digiburst, guys, and today, in this video, I have a terrible, awful, horrible prediction. Hybrids will dominate the European and Oceania regionals that are happening today. This video is going live on the day of that regionals for those days. In Australia, it would be a Sunday. In Europe, this is a Saturday. In this way, this video here will try to remove as much of my corrupting information as possible, so I will have as little influence over the results as much as I can, while also trying to put out a prediction for how I think the tournaments will go. These tournaments are the first tournaments of BT8. They're happening on the pre-release days that you Americans would get it, but we've had it in Australia and Europe for about 2 weeks now. So what do I mean by dominating these tournaments? Well, I'll specifically define dominating tournaments by these hybrid decks representing at least 40% of the top 16 decks of either of the two tournaments. This would mean about 7 decks of the top 16s will be hybrid decks. And why have I come to this conclusion? Well, I have a lot of information to divulge to you. First of all, players already have a lot of experience in playing hybrid decks. For the last 2 months, we've been in BT7 and playing hybrid decks. We had BT7 or hybrid decks specifically for Ultimate Cup, and a lot of people who are playing at these regionals played in Ultimate Cup and have a lot of experience in those decks and those specific playstyles. On the other hand, regular BT8 decks like Imperial, Armor Rush, Black War Greymon, X Antibody, they typically only had, those decks have only had official release for the past 2 weeks, which means that in a comparison of experience, hybrid decks or hybrid players have a lot more experience in playing with those decks than a comparative BT8 player. And when it comes to practice with the deck, the more practice you have with the deck, the more knowledgeable and experienced you are with the deck. And that generally translates to the best results you'll get, because you'll be making more efficient plays, making the better plays, you'll be misplaying, and you'll know your win condition in a lot more concrete sense. Factor number 2, players are not expecting to play against hybrid decks. A lot of players are thinking a lot about BT8. They're thinking about what decks are new in BT8 and what to expect from BT8 decks. Well, in BT8 decks, they're expecting Black War Greymon, they're expecting Pale Digimon, they're expecting Yellow Purple Jawgrising Master Digimon, they're expecting Armor Rush, they're expecting X Antibody, sometimes even Shivamon. They're expecting the new decks that they might not have experience playing against simply because of the shorter time frame. And generally, that's the right thing to do. I have a sort of idea that the most commonplace decks, that the most populous played, will be decks that will be BT8 decks. Specifically because people want to play BT8 decks. They want to play decks that are new, refreshing, and out of the format. They want to play decks that are fun to them and that they think they'll win with. Especially considering that they'll consider power creep. Power creep, of course, they have an expectation that BT8 cards are stronger than BT7 cards, simply because that's generally how card games progress. So they want to play the newer cards because they have a perceived notion that BT8 cards are stronger than BT7 cards, which isn't necessarily the case. And by these players making these predictions, they are preparing their decks to face the decks that they think are going to be more commonplace, more populous, so they have a better matchup against them. And in doing so, they're actually making their decks less prepared to go against hybrid decks. They'll have less main deck outs to the strategies that hybrid decks typically play. And I'm talking specifically about memory blockers. When the people think of BT8 decks, there aren't too many memory gaining effects. There is the X Antibody rookie, and there's also a Digimon that gives +1 memory, but not nearly as commonplace as they were in BT7, where you had the likes of Lilith Loop and bokomon with gaining memory. Now, the lack of things such as memory blockers, hybrid decks are going to run away with that and exploit that fact. Now, these events also don't have side decks. So a player who isn't playing the memory blockers wouldn't be able to put that in, because typically without side decks, that's the deck you're dealing with. Point number 3, hybrid decks have gotten better with BT8. Now, I've already mentioned before how players are dropping the memory blockers, and that gives cards like bokomon a lot more relevancy. So in BT7, a lot of blue players were dropping bokomon because in the mirror match you had a lot of removal for bokomon in form of Madoki Betamon, or of course Kendo Garurumon if you're being a little bit spicy. Now I can see that blue hybrid might change their deck to have a couple more bokomons to exploit that memory gain. Yellow hybrid gains access to a bunch of new tamers. This is Kari, the new memory setup, and Cody, which are absolutely fantastic cards. They fit perfectly into the hybrid strategy. Cody specifically being a 3-cost tamer, giving you free memory for having a blue Digimon on board, and of course that minus 2000 when you attack with a multicolored Digimon is very relevant too when you consider cards like Rapidmon that are also being placed in the deck. This also replaces the purple package that was typically played in BT7. This gives the deck a lot more consistency with a single color, and actually a lot more power because they can hold their rookie in the nursery until they're ready to push out that rookie so they can go into a Rapidmon at the most opportune time. They also gain access to DNA Digivolving, which gives them a higher power ceiling for hitting into lethal when they need to pick up their speed. The fact that they can hit with a bunch of hybrids for level 4s and then potentially have them not die in security, because you can pretty much suicide swing into security, and if they live you can use them for fodder for a DNA evolution and get one extra more swing, whether that be a Chimeramon, which actually stacks pretty well with Rapidmon, or if you're super spicy, you can play green cards in blue hybrid and go into Paledramon, which gives you 2 more swings and can easily seal out games for blue hybrid out of nowhere. Point number 4, the main deck strategies that BT8 decks typically employ do not deal well with tamers. Usually. Most BT8 decks are extremely proactive. That generally means that they have a strategy they want to fulfill, and they want to do so without necessarily considering the interruptions or playstyle that the opponent has. They employ some reactive abilities such as removing bodies into their strategies to generally maintain their advantage. The problem with that is when you play proactively like that, you have to rely on your reactive stuff, your smaller reactive strategies within your proactive strategies to deal with your opponent's play style. Unfortunately, because hybrid decks play so passively, generally not risking getting into security, using single turns to amass resources such as playing tamers in order to gain more memory in future turns, and also stockpiling memory boosters, means that these BT8 decks don't have very many natural outs to these strategies. Decks that of course aren't Blackboard, Greymon, Elmastimon, they don't have tamer removal, and they typically play into the strategies that hybrid decks want their opponent to play into. For example, in order to not just pass turn, a lot of decks will hard play Digimon without sources, and that falls straight into Sora and Joe effect to get that extra 2 memory. Also, speaking of Sora and Joe, shredding sources is very relevant in this format because there are a lot of decks that benefit from their inherent effects, like X-Antibody decks, Blackboard Greymon effects, and Imperial. Maintaining the jamming is very important, and hitting into a Tommy in security and shredding the jamming in inherent effect is actually pretty nasty. On the other hand, with Yellow Hybrid, opponents will often play into cards like TK Kari, which once they do a little bit of damage in their security, the yellow player is just going to amass so much advantage once they play that TK Kari. And if the opponent isn't like a super high speed deck, that extra memory every single turn, the yellow player is just going to run away with it. And finally, the few decks that counter tamers or counter hybrid strategies, the new ones that come out in BT8 are, of my opinion, slow and lackluster. Sure, Black War Greymon can potentially remove 2 tamers, and that is significant, but once you shred those sources and start stunning him, that's not great, because the War Greymon player puts a lot of investment in stack. And once that stack is dealt with in such a way, stunned, script sourced, you lose all that investment and you have to start putting investments in a new stack. And that player might not necessarily find their resources, because generally speaking, they do a lot of searching in order to get a correct stack. And to have to redo that all again, they've lost so much advantage in so many turns. And the blue hybrid player will run away from it, and the yellow hybrid player will do the same with DP dropping. The yellow deck that tries to counter hybrid specifically, Mastermon, extremely slow. And extremely fragile too. They have to put their guys on board usually for at least a turn before they can go into their jogger's play. And in that turn, they're extremely vulnerable to removal. Cards like blue hybrid bouncing the Gatomon back to hand, extremely relevant, especially with Gatomon being 5 cost. Typically you pass turn by hard playing the Gatomon, and without having that Gatomon stay in the field, you're in a lot weaker position to go into your jogger's place. And yellow hybrid also counters that pretty well too, because with DP dropping with Rapidmon, it's a sitting duck. So, what does this mean then? Well, if I'm correct, then not great. It means that BT8 wasn't successful in power creeping BT7, and hybrid decks are going to be in a rather strong position in the BT8 meta. It'll be sort of like BT7 2.0, with some alternative strategies of BT8 decks you could play if you don't want to play the hybrids. And is there hope for the format? I think there's some hope. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for Imperial. It's an incredibly fast deck, and it can potentially win out against hybrids in the super early game. So that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that, I'm wrong about this, and we actually do see a lot of progression into BT8 decks. But of course, if I'm right, I can see a lot of backlash happening from this. A lot of people shouting for an emergency banlist on some hybrid cards, or some sort of errata on them to make them a little less good. And that's essentially why on my wish list of the ban list, all the way back in January, I wished that some of the tamer cards actually went to 1, that being Tommy and Izumi. This was all the way back in January. And then with all that outcry, maybe we'll see something happen, but of course this is all hypothetical. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe the tournament doesn't end up that way, but I guess we'll see in 12 hours when we get the results. And I think that wraps up the whole video. If you have any thoughts, opinions, if you agree or disagree, please comment below. I hope we can have a civil discussion about this and actually think about what are the strengths of hybrids and where can they sit in the new BT8 meta. And of course, if you liked the video, give it a like, give me a sub, check out the rest of my videos. We've got quite a couple of BT8 matches and deck profiles already on the channel, and I'll see you next time.